The snow fell like ash, thick and unrelenting, burying the world in a suffocating hush that seemed to press against Jonas's chest with every step. Each flake clung to the pines like frost-kissed shrouds, their skeletal branches clawing at the bruised sky, which hung low and heavy, promising more to come. Jonas Holt moved through the forest as if he were part of it, a shadow stitched into the cold, his breath a fleeting ghost against the dark. His boots crunched over the frozen crust of the snowpack, the sound sharp and brittle, echoing in the stillness. 2 winters had hollowed him, carving his body lean and his heart brittle, leaving behind a man who wore his solitude like a second skin. Eleanor's grave lay hidden beneath the frozen cottonwood, its markers swallowed by drifts, her laughter now a phantom echo in his mind, a ghost that haunted the corners of his silence. He'd stopped speaking aloud long ago. Words felt useless, like prayers to a god who'd stopped listening. The rifle slung across his back was a relic of necessity, its weight a familiar anchor, though his hands had grown numb to its touch. That night, the wind shifted, carrying a sound that pierced the numbness, a cry, sharp and raw, slicing through the silence like a blade. Not the whimper of an animal, not the groan of ice-strained trees, but the terror of a child. Jonas froze, his boots sinking into the snowdrifts, the cold seeping through his boots until his toes went numb. His hands, stiff and chapped from the cold, left a rifle untouched. Instinct pulled him downhill toward the source, where the earth dipped into a clearing like a wound in the landscape. There, beneath the skeletal arms of a dead oak, a woman stood like a fortress. Her coat, threadbare and soaked, hung off her shoulders like a tattered banner, its fabric clinging to her frame as if begging for warmth. She clutched 2 girls to her chest, her arms locked around them like iron bands. The older child buried her face in her mother's skirts, fists clenched in fabric, her muffled sobs swallowed by the night. The younger stared ahead, wide-eyed, her lips parted in silent shock, her small body trembling against the cold. A stick trembled in the mother's grip, a futile shield against 3 wolves circling like grim reapers. Their ribs jutted beneath matted fur, gaunt and desperate, eyes glowing like smoldering coals, saliva glinting in the moonlight. The pack leader lunged, muscles coiled to spring, and Jonas acted. The rifle cracked once, the shot detonating into the air with a deafening roar. The wolves scattered, yelping, vanishing into the trees like smoke. Only one paused, turning its head to fix Jonas with a glare that promised vengeance before melting into the shadows. The silence that followed was thicker than snowfall, a heavy, oppressive weight that seemed to settle into the marrow of the earth. The mother didn't move, her body rigid as a statue, arms locked around her daughters like iron bands. The youngest girl let out a shuddering sob, her tiny fingers clutching at her mother's coat as if afraid she might dissolve into the cold. Jonas stepped closer, his voice gravel-low, softened by the weight of shared fear. "Come with me," he said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue, rough and unpracticed. The woman's gaze met his, hollowed by exhaustion and the raw edge of survival. Her eyes were dark pools, rimmed with red, her cheeks streaked with tears that had frozen into delicate tracks. She didn't speak, didn't nod, just held his stare like he was another wolf in disguise, waiting for the moment to strike. Then, slowly, the youngest girl lifted her hand, trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. Her small fingers brushed the hem of Jonas's coat, a silent plea that spoke louder than words. That was enough. Without another word, he turned, leading them up the trail where the snow whispered secrets beneath their feet, the cabin's faint smoke curling into the sky like a beckoning hand. The path was treacherous, the snow deep and unyielding, but Jonas moved with steady purpose, his breath rising in clouds that vanished into the dark. Behind him, The woman followed, her steps slow and deliberate, her daughters clinging to her like vines. The younger girl stumbled, her small legs sinking into the snowdrifts, but Jonas paused, waiting, his presence a silent promise that she would not fall. The forest closed around them, its skeletal trees casting long shadows that danced in the moonlight, the wind sighing through the branches like a mournful lullaby. When the cabin finally came into view, its wooden walls dark and weathered, the sight of it felt like a miracle, a beacon in the wilderness. Smoke rose from the chimney in lazy spirals, a promise of warmth and safety, though Jonas knew the ghosts that lingered within. The woman hesitated at the threshold, her breath visible in the cold air, her eyes scanning the porch as if expecting it to vanish beneath her weight. Jonas pushed open the door, the creak of the hinges loud in the quiet, and gestured for them to enter. The fire inside roared like a living thing, its glow spilling onto the floorboards, chasing away the shadows. Here, in this fragile sanctuary, the silence was no longer hollow. It was full, brimming with the quiet certainty of roots taking hold. The cabin creaked like a living thing, its wooden beams groaning softly as if exhaling after years of solitude. The sound was almost human, a low, shuddering breath that echoed through the rafters, as though the walls themselves remembered Eleanor's laughter and mourned her absence. Smoke coiled from the chimney in lazy spirals, twisting into the violet dusk like a whispered invitation, its scent mingling with the pine resin and damp earth outside. Inside, the warmth hit them like a living breath, the fire's glow casting long shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts. The air was thick with the lingering aroma of stew, a ghost of Eleanor's hands, her memory stitched into every spice and simmered hour. The richness of bone broth and rosemary clung to the room, a bittersweet contrast to the sharp scent of wet wool and fear that clung to Clara's coat. Jonas moved with quiet purpose, his boots muffled against the floorboards, the weight of silence pressing against his ribs. He handed 10 cups of broth to the girls, his calloused fingers brushing the metal with a practiced steadiness honed by years of solitude. The older child, Tessa, whispered something to her mother before accepting the cup with both hands, her fingers trembling against the tin. Her voice was too low for Jonas to catch, but her eyes flickered to the rifle propped near the door, then back to her mother, a silent exchange of caution. The younger, Ivy, curled by the fire like a small animal retreating into its den, her eyelids drooping as the heat seeped into her skin. She hugged her knees to her chest, her breath hitching in a rhythm that betrayed exhaustion and the lingering tremors of terror. Clara sat stiffly, her coat still clinging to her shoulders like armor, the damp fabric steaming faintly in the heat. Her eyes darted between the flickering shadows and the man who had saved them, dissecting every movement. The way Jonas's hands lingered near the rifle, the way his gaze softened when it landed on Ivy. When she finally spoke, her voice was dry as dead leaves, brittle and low. "Thank you." The words hung between them, raw yet unadorned, as if she feared speaking louder might shatter the fragile truce of safety. She spoke little of her husband then, only that he had drowned weeks ago, his body swallowed by a river swollen with meltwater, leaving her cart broken and wolves trailing their scent like hunters. Jonas nodded, his throat tight. He knew how close death had come. He'd lived in its shadow long enough to recognize its breath on the back of their necks. "Stay the night," he said, though the words felt heavier than they should, as if the cabin itself resisted the intrusion of strangers. The fire crackled, its embers popping like tiny protests, while the wind outside moaned against the shutters, a reminder that the wilderness was still waiting. That night, the wind howled like a wounded thing, clawing at the shutters and seeping through cracks in the walls, carrying the metallic tang of snow and the earthy musk of pine. Clara sat rigid in the dim firelight, Her daughters curled against her like small birds seeking shelter from a storm. Ivy's head rested on her lap, her tangled hair haloed by the fire's glow, while Tessa pressed close to her mother's side, clutching a corner of Clara's coat like an anchor. Clara didn't sleep, her eyes flickering open every hour, scanning the room with the vigilance of someone who'd learned to expect betrayal. She noted the way Jonas's jaw tightened as he stoked the fire, the way his hands hovered near the rifle even as he moved with deliberate calm. From the shadows, she watched him, the hollows of his face catching the firelight, his shoulders hunched under an invisible weight. In the silence, he saw the grief etched into her posture, the way her shoulders sagged under invisible burdens. It mirrored his own, a hollowed ache carved by loss, by the kind of pain that didn't scream but gnawed quietly at the edges of survival. When dawn came, it arrived with a pale, reluctant light, the fire reduced to glowing coals that hissed faintly as Jonas fed them fresh logs. Biscuits sizzled in the skillet, their buttery scent cutting through the lingering smoke, a stubborn promise of normalcy. The girls ate like starved animals, their hunger louder than their fear. Ivy smearing honey across her bread with sticky fingers while Tessa devoured hers in silent, methodical bites. Clara hesitated before taking the coffee Jonas offered, her fingers brushing his for half a second. A spark, a memory, not of Eleanor, not of her husband, but of a time when touch meant safety, not obligation. When she thanked him again, quieter now, Jonas let her go, his chest tightening at the thought of her leaving. But an hour later, as he walked the ridge again, the snow crunching beneath his boots, he saw it, the tracks in the snow. Small, sharp wolf prints, following hers like ink blots on a map. He cursed under his breath, the weight of the rifle across his back suddenly familiar, as if the past had never left him. The wind carried a warning, but inside the cabin, something fragile had begun to thaw. The fires still burned, stubborn and bright, refusing to let the cold reclaim its throne. And for the first time in years, Jonas felt the ache of something unfamiliar, a hope that flickered like the flames, defiant against the encroaching dark. Jonas found them a mile down the trail, where the snow had deepened into a treacherous slurry of ice and slush. The wind had turned spiteful, slicing through Clara's coat until it clung to her like a second skin, stiff and heavy with frost. The girls lagged behind her, their small bodies hunched against the cold, their boots leaving shallow imprints that the wind erased almost instantly. Ivy stumbled, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her cheeks flushed crimson from exertion and exposure. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped her daughters, her eyes darting to the shadows between the trees, where the wolves' breaths had mingled with the wind all afternoon. She hadn't dared stop, hadn't allowed herself to hope they'd outrun the pack. But then Jonas stepped into their path, his silhouette sharp against the gray horizon, his hand outstretched like a bridge across the void. Clara stared at it, her face hollowed by exhaustion, her mind warring between the instinct to flee and the unbearable weight of her children's collapse. Ivy whimpered, clutching her mother's skirts, while Tessa pressed closer, her gaze locked on the dark shapes flickering at the tree-line. For a heartbeat, Clara hesitated. Then her fingers brushed Jonas's, raw and chapped from the cold, and she let him pull her forward. Back at the cabin, the fire roared as if it had been waiting, its heat licking at the damp air and melting the frost from their clothes. The girls sank into blankets like drowning swimmers breaking the surface, their shivering bodies curled into tight balls beneath the quilts. Clara sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, her boots still laced, her eyes scanning the room for threats that no longer existed. Outside, the wolves circled, closer now, their howls threading through the cracks in the walls like icy fingers. Inside, something shifted, imperceptible yet undeniable. For souls beneath one roof, bound not by blood but by the fragile threads of survival and shared silence. The hollowness that had defined Jonas's solitude began to fray at the edges, replaced by the soft rustle of blankets, the faint crackle of the fire, the rhythmic breathing of children who had finally stopped running. Days passed like soft snowfall, quiet and unassuming, each one blending into the next until the rhythm of their coexistence felt less like an accident and more like a choice. Clara moved through the cabin with a quiet determination, her hands never still. She cooked without asking where the flour came from, kneading dough until her knuckles turned white, her movements precise and methodical. She mended curtains torn by the winter wind, scrubbed floors until the wood gleamed, and split wood until her palms blistered, her sweat leaving faint stains on the axe handle. Jonas watched her from the corner of his eye, carving wooden animals for Ivy, who followed him like a shadow, her small fingers tracing the grain of the wood as he worked. Tessa remained wary, her gaze sharp and assessing. But even she began to linger near the hearth, listening to Jonas's stories of the land, her silence less guarded than before. One night, the storm raged with a fury that shook the cabin's foundations. The wind howled like a wounded thing, and the snow lashed against the windows in sheets. Clara tucked the girls into the big bed near the fire, her hands lingering on their foreheads as if to anchor them to the world. When she turned to Jonas, her voice was low and steady. "You can stay," she said, nodding toward the empty space beside them. Jonas hesitated, his body rigid with the weight of unspoken fears, but the girl's pleading eyes, Ivy's wide and hopeful, Tessa's cautious but resigned, sealed his decision. He lay stiffly beside them, his arms crossed over his chest, the heat of their bodies a foreign warmth against his ribs. Ivy curled onto his arm, her breath soft and even, while Clara settled on the other side, her back to the wall, her eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the firelight. The flames flickered, casting long, dancing shapes on the ceiling, and for the first time in years, Jonas felt the ache of something unfamiliar, a sense of belonging that didn't come from loss, but from presence. Morning came with the storm's retreat, leaving the world hushed and glistening beneath a fresh layer of snow. Clara stood at the doorway, her coffee steaming in the cold air, her gaze sweeping the horizon for signs of the wolves. Jonas stirred the embers, their glow a muted echo of the fire's former strength. "We'll need more kindling," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep but steady. She nodded, the motion slow and deliberate, her eyes meeting his for the first time with something softer than fear. "We've still got time before spring." The words hung between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the fragile hope taking root in the cabin's corners. Outside, the wolves' tracks lingered in the snow, but the forest held its breath, waiting. Inside, the fire burned on, stubborn and bright, refusing to let the cold reclaim its throne. The snow softened like butter left in the sun, its edges melting into rivulets that trickled from the eaves with a sound like whispered secrets. The thaw crept through the land, slow but relentless, coaxing the earth from its winter slumber. Jonas carved by the hearth each morning, his hands shaping wood into creatures that seemed to breathe with quiet life. A fox with a sly tilt to its head, a bear with paws curled as if mid-step. The shavings curled around his boots like pale ribbons, the scent of pine sharp and clean in the air. Ivy watched him with wide eyes, her small fingers tracing the grain of each finished piece as though memorizing its magic. One afternoon, she presented him with a lasso of knotted yarn, its loops uneven but earnest. "For the fox," she said, her voice a mixture of pride and shyness. Jonas accepted it solemnly, draping it over the carved animal's neck before tucking both onto the shelf beside Eleanor's old books. The gesture felt like a bridge, a child's offering stitched from trust. Tessa, meanwhile, had claimed the armchair near the window as her own, burying herself in Eleanor's weathered volumes of fairy tales and frontier histories. Her voice, steady and deliberate, filled the cabin during quiet afternoons, reading aloud stories of brave girls who outwitted wolves and giants. She stumbled over some words, but never faltered. Her determination mirrored in the way she gripped the pages, as if holding the stories too tightly might keep them from slipping away. Clara listened from the kitchen, her hands kneading dough or scrubbing pans, her lips twitching at the corners when Tessa's narration grew dramatic. The girl's voice carried a weight beyond her years, a steadiness that anchored the household even as the world outside shifted beneath the thaw. Clara herself had begun to move through the cabin with a kind of quiet purpose, her steps no longer tentative but sure. She hung her washing on the line behind the house, the fabric flapping like flags in the breeze, and pressed seeds into Eleanor's herb pots with a reverence that felt almost sacred. The pots sat on the windowsill now, their soil dark and damp, waiting. One morning, Jonas found her humming at the stove, the melody unfamiliar but warm, like the scent of roasted apples that filled the cabin. The fruit sizzled in a pan, caramelizing in butter and cinnamon, its sweetness thick enough to cling to the walls. "Feast?" he asked, leaning against the counter, his hands still dusted with wood shavings. She shrugged, her shoulders loose in a way he hadn't seen before. "Just like the smell," she replied, flipping an apple slice with a flick of her wrist. He watched her, noting how the sunlight caught the gold in her hair, how her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, her hands busy but unguarded. "Maybe the world is sweeter," he said, the words slipping out before he could second-guess them. Clara glanced at him, her eyes softening at the edges. "Maybe it is," she agreed, and for a moment, the air between them felt lighter, as if the thaw had reached into corners even the sun couldn't touch. They hiked to the river days later, when the ice thinned to glassy sheets and the first green shoots pushed through the soil. The girls ran ahead, Tessa skipping stones across the water's surface, Ivy chasing shadows cast by the willows, her laughter ringing out like a bell. Clara walked beside Jonas, her boots crunching over frost-softened ground, her pace easy. At the bend, she kicked off her shoes and perched on a flat rock, her toes wiggling in the sunlight. Jonas crouched nearby, watching her, the way her face tilted upward as if drinking in the warmth. The river gurgled beside them, its current swift and silver, carrying bits of ice downstream like memories dissolving. Something cracked open in his chest. Not longing, not guilt, but a quiet ache of something returned. Not Eleanor, not the past, but a sense of belonging that had no name. That night, as the fire dimmed to glowing coals, Clara spoke again, her voice low but certain. "This isn't how I thought my life would turn out," she said, her gaze fixed on the embers. Jonas nodded, the truth of her words settling over him like a shared blanket. "Me neither," he admitted, but there was no bitterness in it, only wonder. Ivy curled between them, reached for his hand without asking, her small fingers wrapping around his thumb. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and new growth. Inside, the silence was no longer hollow but full, brimming with the quiet certainty of roots taking hold. The letter arrived on a brittle morning, its edges curled like dried leaves, the envelope sealed with a flourish of wax that cracked under Jonas's thumb. Silas's handwriting sprawled across the page, tight, jagged strokes that seemed to claw at the paper itself. "The ranch needs you. The north pasture is failing. Pa's grave has sunk into mud. You've abandoned your name." Jonas read it once, then again, his jaw tightening with each word. He didn't speak of it, not to Clara, not to the girls. Instead, he fed the letter to the stove, watching the flames consume the inked accusations until only ash remained, swirling like ghosts into the chimney. Clara said nothing as the smoke coiled between them, her eyes tracing the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands lingered near the rifle propped by the door. That night, the wind howled, rattling the shutters as if demanding entry. Jonas sat rigid by the fire, its glow casting sharp shadows across his face, his knuckles white around his knees. Clara approached silently, her presence a warm contrast to the storm outside. She knelt beside him, her hand settling over his like a promise. "If there's something I need to know," she began, her voice low but steady. Jonas shook his head, though his voice softened when he answered, "There isn't." He hesitated, then added, "But there's something coming. Family." The word tasted bitter, foreign. Clara studied him, her fingers pressing lightly against his wrist as if to steady the tremor she felt there. "Let them come," she said simply, her gaze unwavering. The wolves hadn't returned since the thaw began, its slow creep into the land like a whispered secret. Grass pushed through snow in stubborn tufts. The mules stomped lively hooves in the yard, and the creek gurgled louder with meltwater. But Jonas kept watch, his rifle never far, his eyes scanning the ridgeline at dawn. When riders finally appeared, two figures silhouetted against the pale sky, his stomach tightened. They rode hard, dust kicking up behind them, until they halted at the fence line. Silas dismounted first, his boots crunching gravel as he dusted off his jacket with practiced arrogance. Micah trailed him, younger and uneasy, his eyes darting to the cabin where Ivy skipped in circles, her laughter slicing through the tension. Jonas leaned on the fence, his hands clenched until his nails bit into his palms. "The ranch is half yours," Silas began, his voice sharp enough to cut wood. "Pa's grave needs tending. You belong to more than this." His gaze swept past Jonas to the cabin, lingering on Clara in the doorway, her back straight, her chin lifted. "She's using you," Silas spat, his lip curling. "Eyes too sharp, hands too eager. She's got you soft, feeding your loneliness so you don't notice what's being taken." Jonas's jaw clenched, his voice low but unyielding. "You're wrong." For a heartbeat, Silas hesitated, his eyes narrowing at the defiance in his brother's stance. Then he laughed, a dry, hollow sound, and turned away, mounting his horse with a sneer. Micah lingered, glancing between Jonas and Clara before following without a word. Clara approached as the dust settled, her steps deliberate but unhurried. "They think you're being fooled," she said, her voice cutting through the silence left by hooves. Jonas looked down at his hands, still trembling with suppressed anger, and exhaled sharply. "They think I'm betraying Eleanor." The admission hung heavy, raw. Clara paused, her gaze softening as she studied him. "Grief doesn't end with new love," she said quietly, her words measured but firm. "It learns to walk beside it." Jonas met her eyes, searching for the truth in her face. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, she reached for his hand, her callous palm grounding him. "You've chosen this," she added, her voice steady. "And I've chosen you. Let them carry their judgment back to their barns and pulpits. It doesn't belong here." Inside, the girls hovered near the window, Ivy's small hands clutching the sill, Tessa's arms crossed tightly over her chest. Clara glanced at them, then back to Jonas. "They're not the wolves," she murmured, "but they'll try to make you feel like prey anyway." Jonas nodded, the weight in his chest shifting, not gone but lighter. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the sky bruised but clear. The wolves still hadn't returned, but Jonas kept the rifle close, his vigilance undimmed. The thaw pressed onward, the land softening beneath their feet, but the scars of winter lingered. And in the quiet that followed, something unspoken settled between them, a resolve forged not in words, but in the shared breath of survival and the quiet, stubborn act of staying. The leather satchel lay open on the table, its worn edges frayed from years of use, now becoming the vessel for Clara's quiet resignation. She moved with deliberate care, folding dried apples into cloth bundles, stacking salted meat beside jars of honey scraped from the last harvest. Her hands trembled only once. A fleeting shudder she steadied by gripping the edge of the table. Outside, the wind whispered through the eaves, carrying the faint scent of thawing earth. But inside the cabin, the air felt heavy, weighted by the unspoken truth of her actions. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts of old regrets. Jonas found her just as she reached for the final jar. A half-empty tin of pickled beets Silas had left behind, a bitter offering disguised as kindness. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the fading light, his coat still dusted with wood shavings from the shed. "You don't have to leave," he said, his voice roughened by exhaustion but steady. Clara didn't look up. Her fingers tightened around the jar before setting it into the satchel with a soft clink. "I know," she replied, her tone hollow. He stepped closer, boots creaking over floorboards, until the heat of his presence filled the space between them. "Then why?" he asked, the question raw at the edges. She finally turned to him, her eyes glistening but unyielding. "I won't let them think you've been fooled," she said, her voice rising with quiet defiance. "And I won't let you carry my weight like penance." The words hung between them, a mirror of his own fears, of being judged, of betraying Eleanor's memory, of clinging to something fragile simply because it offered warmth. Jonas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he knelt before the girls, who stood frozen in the doorway like statues carved from grief. Ivy clutched her wooden rabbit, its carved ears worn smooth from her grip, while Tessa's face remained unreadable, her eyes too old, too guarded, as if bracing for another loss. "Your mama saved my life," Jonas said, his voice soft but certain, addressing the girls as much as Clara, "when she let me belong again." His gaze shifted to Clara, raw and unflinching. "And I won't let you walk away because of what they think." Clara's breath hitched, her composure cracking. "Don't make me walk away again," she whispered, the plea trembling in her throat. For a heartbeat, silence stretched. Then Jonas reached for the satchel, lifting it gently from the table and setting it aside. The gesture was final, a quiet rebellion against the forces trying to pull them apart. Clara stepped forward, her body swaying toward him as if drawn by gravity. Her forehead rested against his chest, the steady beat of his heart grounding her. "I'm tired of running," she murmured, the admission muffled against his coat. "Then stay," he said, his hands rising to cradle her shoulders, anchoring her in place. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, a sound that might have been mistaken for wolves, but none came. Inside, the fire flared brighter as Jonas stirred the embers, their glow painting the room in amber. That night, the cabin glowed, not just with firelight, but with the quiet triumph of choice. Clara braided Tessa's hair by the hearth, her fingers moving with practiced ease, weaving strands into a crown that made the girl's lips twitch upward, a rare, fleeting smile. Jonas sat beside Ivy, mending her doll with clumsy precision, the thread catching awkwardly in his calloused fingers. The riders weren't spoken of. Their shadows had been banished, at least for now. When Ivy reached for his hand, tugging him toward the cot where the girls would sleep curled like pups, Clara lingered by the window. She watched the treeline, her back straight, her breath fogging the glass. Jonas joined her, his presence a silent promise. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but connected by the shared rhythm of their breath. "They'll come back," she said quietly, her voice tinged with weariness. "Maybe," he replied, his gaze fixed on the dark. "But they'll find us here." The wolves didn't come. Neither did the riders. Only the wind remained, weaving through the trees, carrying the scent of spring's slow, stubborn arrival. And in the cabin, where laughter had once been a stranger, the silence was no longer hollow. It was full, brimming with the quiet certainty of roots taking hold. A week after Silas rode away, the frost finally loosened its grip on the land, leaving the earth damp and eager beneath Clara's hands. She knelt in the garden bed, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, fingers pressing seeds into the soil with the reverence of someone planting hope itself. The sack of corn seed had appeared at the fence line at dawn, unmarked and heavy with quiet concession. She hadn't asked Jonas if he'd left it. She'd simply smiled, humming a tune she couldn't quite place, as if her body remembered joy before her mind could catch up. The wind had softened, carrying the scent of wet bark and thawing earth, and Jonas watched her from the porch, his hands braced on the railing. He noted the way her back curved as she worked, the stubborn fire in her spirit that refused to dim, even when shadows lingered at the edges of their world. The wagon came mid-morning, creaking up the trail in a cloud of dust and axle groans. Clara rose to her feet, wiping her palms on her apron as Jonas straightened, his jaw tightening. 3 figures disembarked, Silas, rigid as ever, flanked by the preacher from Pine Hollow, his smile slick with false sympathy, and a lawyer whose gaze darted like a weasel's, already measuring the property for its worth. Clara gripped her garden trowel, knuckles whitening as Silas strode forward. "Complaints," he began, his voice a blade sheathed in politeness. "About the children. About Clara. About you." The preacher stepped closer, his tone oily. "Stable environment. Proper homes. Surely you understand, Mr. Holt." Jonas folded his arms, his voice low but unyielding. "This is their home. Earned. Every corner." The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. Without legal standing, he began, but Jonas cut him off, turning to Clara. "I'll marry her now," he said, the words falling like a hammer strike. "Today." The preacher gaped, sputtering about licenses and sanctuaries, but Clara reached into her apron, her fingers closing around something small and silver, a ring, plain and worn, once part of her mother's locket. She held it out, her eyes steady. "Do it right," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "But do it now." The ceremony was a blur of stumbling vows and aching sincerity. Clara said, "Yes," like she was staking her life on a single breath. Jonas said, "Yes," like a man who'd waited lifetimes to speak. Ivy spun in circles, clapping, while Tessa hugged Jonas's waist, her solemn face cracking into something like wonder. The preacher fled first, muttering about decorum, followed by the lawyer, who cast one last glance at the cabin as if memorizing its flaws. Silas lingered, his mouth a tight line, before leaving a sack of grain and pickled beets on the porch, a gesture neither apology nor acceptance, but something in between. As the sun sank, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Clara moved through the cabin like someone rediscovering it. Her fingers brushed the mantel, the quilt Eleanor had stitched, the shelf where Jonas's carved fox and Ivy's yarn lasso now sat side by side. Jonas pulled her close on the threshold, her back to his chest, his chin resting on her shoulder. "You still want to build that fence?" she teased, her voice lighter than it had been in years. He smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Only if you help pick the wood," he murmured. Outside, the land stretched wide and unbroken, the wolves' howls distant but present, a reminder that peace was never permanent, only fiercely chosen. Inside, the fire crackled, and the girls' laughter wove through the air, stitching the silence full once more. Here, where love had rooted instead of rushing, the light stayed. And no shadow, old or new, would take it. Not now, not ever. Spring arrived in stages, tentative yet relentless. First, the sap ran thick and golden in the trees, dripping from gashes like liquid memory. Then came the bird song, sparrows and thrushes returning to the pines, their melodies stitching the air with a joy that felt almost defiant. Green pushed through the snow in stubborn tufts, crocuses blooming like small, purple flames. The cabin, once a fortress against the cold, now breathed with warmth. The scent of cinnamon and fresh bread clung to every surface, mingling with the earthy tang of turned soil and the sharp sweetness of Clara's herb garden. She laughed aloud now, her head tipped back, eyes crinkled at the corners, her laughter a sound as unexpected and bright as sunlight after rain. Tessa sat on the porch steps, reading fairy tales aloud to Ivy, her voice steady and clear, the stories of brave girls and clever foxes weaving through the air like spells. Ivy, ever restless, braided wildflowers into the mule's mane, naming him Luther with the authority of a child who believed she could reshape the world with words. Jonas worked near the shed, sharpening the scythe until the blade sang under his touch, its edge glinting like a promise. The land hummed with life, and for a moment, the past felt buried beneath the roots of the present. Then the wagon came. It creaked up the trail in a cloud of dust and axle groans, the wheels crunching gravel like bones underfoot. Jonas straightened as soon as he heard the sound, his hands tightening on the scythe handle. Clara rose from the garden, dirt under her nails and a smudge of soil on her cheek, her posture stiffening before she even turned. Ivy clung to her skirt, her usual boldness faltering, while Tessa stepped protectively in front of her sister, her jaw trembling but her gaze unyielding. 3 figures disembarked. Silas, his face carved from oak and bitterness, the preacher from Pine Hollow with his oily smile, and the lawyer whose spectacles glinted like ice. They moved as one, a procession of judgment. Jonas stepped forward, his boots sinking into the softened earth, his voice low but unyielding. "This is their home," he said, gesturing to the cabin, its windows glowing even in daylight. "Earned. Every beam." The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his papers. Without legal standing, he began, but Jonas cut him off, his voice like stone. "I'll marry her now." The words fell heavy, silencing the protest before it could take root. The preacher stammered through the vows, his voice trembling as if the weight of the moment might crush him. Clara stood tall, her ring glinting. A simple silver band pulled from her apron pocket, a relic of her mother's locket, a symbol of defiance and hope. Ivy clapped, her small hands striking together like thunder, while Tessa stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Jonas's waist, her embrace fierce and wordless. The lawyer retreated, Silas mounted his horse without a word, and the preacher fled, his coattails flapping like defeated flags. As the wagon disappeared down the trail, Clara turned to Jonas, her fingers brushing his. "You still want to build that fence?" she teased, her voice light but her eyes steady. He smiled, pulling her close. "Only if you help pick the wood," he murmured. Later, as dusk bled into night, the wolf appeared at the clearing's edge. Its yellow eyes glowed under the moonlight, calm and assessing, its gaunt body still as a shadow. It did not snarl or analyze, did not circle with hunger. It simply watched, the cabin's glow reflecting in its gaze, the laughter of children and crackle of firelight marking a boundary it would not cross. Then, as if understanding that this place no longer belonged to the wild, it melted into the woods without a sound, leaving only tracks in the damp earth. The cabin glowed long after dark, its light spilling onto the porch where Clara and Jonas sat hand in hand, the girls curled beside them like pups. Here, where love had rooted instead of rushing, where silence had made space for belonging, the light stayed. No storm could douse it, no bitter voice unravel it, no shadow from the past reclaim it. Not now, not ever. The wolves had gone, and the land, once frozen and hollow, now thrived with the quiet certainty of roots tangled deep, holding fast against the world.